All right, folks. So we have 1 minute until this officially starts. Thank you for joining us, first of all. Second, if I am looking at my phone today, that's because that's how I'm receiving your questions from home. And you're saying to yourself, what questions from home? Well, there is a chat box at the bottom of your screen. It says Q&A. You just click that. It'll open a box and you can put your questions right in that box.
Better than QAnon.
Yes, well, we don't know if he's watching.
Oh my, here we go, we're starting already.
Absolutely brilliant. All right, thank you and welcome to our webinar today, preparing for the next budget and legislative session. I have 3 experts with me. We're going to meet them in a second, but first I have to say, we want your questions about our conversation. So if you see the bottom of your screen, there's a button that says Q&A. Click that. Your questions will go in the chat box that pops up. We look forward to answering those today. So let's meet the experts that we have today. So I'm going to start over there. Tracy Brooks leads our firm's healthcare practice. She was formerly the head of a large nonprofit that got money in the budget every year. So that's going to be a big topic. She's known for her skill at navigating the intricacies of the state administrative and legislative process, and also agency rulemaking, right? Next to her, we have Doug Clark. Doug is the leader of our government relations practice here at Schenker Russo & Clark. Before entering private practice, he was the assistant counsel to the Assembly Majority Leader's Office, and then the senior associate counsel for Assembly Ways and Means. Next to me here is Ed Draves. He is the director of government affairs here at SRC. Prior to joining SRC, he was with Bolton St. John's for over 20 years, where he was a partner. The Buffalo News once called him labor's most savvy political operative.
And we agree.
All right, welcome to you all. So let's begin by putting up on the screen the legislative process as given to us by the Department of Budget. Just going to be a second for that graphic to appear. All right, so you should see that in front of you now. So this is from all information from the Department of Budget. What it says is that the official process starts in June or somewhere between June and September, when the DOB puts out an official call letter with the governor's priorities for the year. That kicks off a process where agencies then get their packages approved within the agency, and those then go to DOB. DOB then interrogates those. As you can read on the screen, there might be informal hearings with the agencies. And then after those are finalized, there's possibly, not always, formal hearings with the legislature. Once that's done, appropriations bills are drafted, and then they go to the governor for review, and then the sort of final decisions are made from that office. So that's the overview you're seeing on the screen. But I want to sort of lose the graphic now and go to Tracy. Tracy, you've navigated this process very successfully for this nonprofit organization.
Sure.
What's your familiarity with? How much does it work really like that in that sort of linear way?
So in preparing for today, we actually found that 3 of us have been lobbying on behalf of clients for budget for our whole careers, and not one of us does it the same way. So there are a number of ways to pull together budget priorities and to express them and work with them in the state. What I'm going to talk about right now is when you have a line item already. When you have an organization or you are an organization that already has been contemplated by the state for funding, how do you ensure that your line is protected? And then, if you need that line to see increased funding in the year, what's the avenue of doing that without giving away the ghost? Because certainly I would say, come and talk to me. I'd be happy to do it with you.
Absolutely.
What I would say to you is it's very important to talk to all of the folks involved. So what you've heard, what you saw on your screen is there's a time where the agencies are putting together their budget. So the organization I worked specifically with only one agency. And so we made sure we were talking to the bureau that was responsible for the funding that the members of the organization were receiving. We talked about what was going on in the industry, what was going on out throughout the state, how far the funding was reaching, where some new ideas for new initiatives were, and how the state might want to get ahead of some of those initiatives by looking at some additional programs and opportunities. From there, we would move and talk with the various departments and divisions within the DOB that were responsible for the fiscal outcomes of the state and putting together the final budget and talk about why the existing monies were important and then why looking at new initiatives would be important and how to raise money and increase it and where those monies could come from. And then finally, there certainly is the legislative piece, because if all else fails, the legislature may be able to backfill you. So it's important that you are working with all pieces of government and moving your initiatives forward. But first, you really need to have a really strong understanding about where the funding is, what's going on, how it's being used, and why and how it should be increased if that's necessary. And where would that money come from? And how can the state easily find those new dollars, not just why are they needed? One of the things that we talked about today, and I think that we're going to talk about beyond how do you protect a line versus how do you get a new line in, is what does a budget look like? And so we really need to start thinking about that as well. I could talk about it. I'm going to pass it to the guys because I could talk for the whole hour by myself. But one of the things that we talked about in preparation was, what is inflation going to do with this budget? What's the new governor's narrative going to be going into this next budget cycle, and how much is the election going to impact what happens with the budget based on last year's budget and a governor who had ascended into a role as opposed to is establishing their own administration. So
Tracy, that was brilliant summation.
Thank you.
First of all, the entire process, but also everything we're going to get into later today. And I want to ask you a specific question about that, though.
Okay.
So that presents a very linear process they saw with the graphic. Does everybody start in that beginning place with the agencies, or can you start sort of in the middle?
No, I mean, I think you can start, there's all different sorts of places
Sure.
to start. And if we're talking about a budget line that already exists, you have to know the constituencies and stakeholders that were involved in that budget line. And that budget line is not going to just have relevance to the executive, it's also going to have relevance to legislators and their constituents. So obviously, while you can talk to the agencies, it's as important to be talking to legislative allies, people that may have worked with you in the past budget to get that in place, that may have worked to adjust what the executive put in, either to make sure that it wasn't cut or to increase it. So it's are there other groups that you're working with in this thing? Are you building an alliance with them to figure out what your ask is going to be? Are you keeping in touch with your legislative allies on this? And it's some things as simple as making sure that they know that those monies are being dispersed and they're doing what they're supposed to be. Legislators want to make sure that if you get money for a program, that the program is actually occurring and it's actually doing what you said it's doing. So there's different ways to start into this process. Absolutely.
Absolutely brilliant. Okay, so my next question is, you have said that this process, as Tracy referenced, is all about the governor forming a narrative. Can you tell me what you mean by that?
Well, I mean, governors have they campaign on, what Cuomo always used to say, it was poetry and then in the prose and things. But a governor has a narrative of why they're governor and what they're trying to do for the state of New York and why they should be the governor, why you elected him as governor and what you're trying to do. And it's a narrative, it's a story. And the budget and her budget will reflect her narrative for the state of New York. And so you want to figure out how your budget line fits into that narrative. If it's something that you've worked a long time with a lot of allies on, and there's been a lot of buy-in from the executive branch before, that's one thing. But there's also times when you have a new program or a new initiative and you have to sit down and talk to the executive and say to them, look, at you guys are trying to accomplish this, and this program, which you now currently is not a part of your budget, actually fits into that and reaches into communities that you want to reach into. So I think it's always very, very important when you're making a budget ask to understand what the governor's narrative is and how that fits into that narrative.
Doug, can I ask you, just as an example, what was the narrative for this most recent budget right? And how did that sort of get awkward because there were two governors working on it, weren't there?
Well, yeah, I think that's, for the last budget, I don't know that you can say there was necessarily an overall tied in narrative other than, we had a lot of money at that point, we had a lot of needs, and a lot of people got a lot of things.
Sure.
But I don't know that you can necessarily look at that budget and say, okay, these are Governor Hochul's priorities going into next year, that you can draw any conclusions necessarily from what was done last year going into, a full 4-year term. So, either way, the governor election goes, it's going to be a new governor with new priorities. I don't, Governor Hochul isn't necessarily a new governor,
Sure.
but this is her first real ability to set the story from the beginning and establish herself as something separate and apart from anything that was already in process when she had to take over while running. So,
Okay. So we've talked about the fact that there is a narrative. Now, most people only hear about that, right, once the budget is formally presented, or from the state of the state. But as sort of insiders, you get a sneak peek of that. Tracy, can you tell us, once you know what that narrative is, how do you sort of pitch your ask to join that narrative or be part of that conversation?
Certainly. So I'm going to piggyback on what Ed has already said, and that is understanding where the governor and where the governor is coming from and what she's trying to accomplish and how she's accomplishing that for the people of the state of New York through the spending in the state of New York. So words and stories are important, and it's important for you to find your way into the story. And so, really being able to craft the successes and craft the vision of what goals could be met through the spending of the state and through the initiatives and support of the state and the governor in particular, is how you want to broach, especially new spending, if you're looking for a new budget line. It's going to be difficult this year. We are hearing that there is a deficit. The governor came out last year with a projected budget that was balanced through 2027, and that was not the budget that was enacted. The budget that was enacted spent a significant amount of money, and now today we're looking at a budget with a multi-billion-dollar deficit, 13 billion out year deficits that we'll be looking at. So although we may be able to find some tricks, where do you find new money and how do you become part of a narrative? Probably a brand new term on basically a brand new governor. Being able to set the stage is the first place to go. And so really watching what the governor has done, what she's doing during her campaign, and looking at who she's been as an elected leader for her career, you really have a good roadmap to see what's important to her in the directions that she's looking to go. If it becomes Governor Hochul and the same, if we end up with Lee Zeldin as potentially the governor. So what we need to do is, to be aware of what initiatives and priorities, but also what's going on in our state and what's going on nationally, and how can the state help impact some of that national story to be able to make significant changes. So I think, really putting it all together, being knowledgeable and knowing where the solutions are that you're bringing to the table, or how, you look at helping government.
So can I ask, we're talking now about defending a budget line that currently exists, right? So if we're going to have what seems to be a down year, you said, the question is, how do you formulate your ask, right? So a common negotiating tactic is you ask for more than you need, so you end up where you want to be, right? Is that something you recommend? What are your various sort of recommendations for how you decide on that number?
You want me to take?
You can start, we can move to the others.
I mean, I can take it.
well, I don't think it changes your approach necessarily
Okay,
that much. I think it goes back to Ed's point about, fitting your story into the narrative.
yes.
But part of that story is getting what you need as well. So, you might need to massage your ask and your presentation, but ultimately the goal is to get the best result for your client. So, with that as a guide, it's, while you have to be cognizant of the issues facing government and don't want to ignore them, I don't know that you necessarily can go in with the notion that you're going to solve all government's problems as well.
Mhm.
You know, your problems are for your client, and you can obviously make it clear to whomever you're making the ask of that this vote does not in any way exacerbate any of the problems that government is facing. And in fact, your story is that it will help. But you don't tie yourself down thinking, I can't solve all these problems, so I got to really minimize my ask and ask for the littlest thing possible. In terms of the narrative, I think it's still being written.
Sure.
Tracy said you have to be aware of what's going on out in the world. Right now, out in the world, we are in an election cycle, but we're also facing something that we haven't faced, I don't know, in 30, 40 years, in terms of inflation having a real impact on the formation of the state budget. That's not to say that inflation didn't exist, but it was at a minimal amount and had been at a minimal amount for decades. Now, on the heels of the pandemic, you've got increased unemployment from where we were. You've got higher than expected inflation. The most recent report sort of blew a hole in what people thought was going to be the narrative. And so that is something that is going to really impact, particularly the number crunchers who try to put together a budget, because remember, the governor has to put forward a balanced budget. The legislature obviously doesn't have to pass one, but the governor does have to put forward a balanced budget.
And that's in the Constitution.
Yes.
Now, Ed, you have a sort of different and sort of one-line philosophy about how to formulate these asks.
Well, I mean, I think when you make your ask, you have to be able to show the legislature and the governor's office that programmatically you can deliver what you say you can deliver in that time frame. So if I've got a program that I can, has this many workers in it, and it can do this, you can't come in and say, I'm going to double that. Like I need twice as much money because I think, oh, they'll cut it back to there, because you only have so many workers. You're not going to hire twice as many. You're not going to, I mean, if you can, so I think part of the thing is building credibility with the legislature and the governor, that when you come in for a program, this is really what the program does, and this is what it can accomplish, and you really need those funding things to do that. And I think that's one of the things that we're talking about, the governor's narrative. You also have to remember that the Senate and the Assembly have narratives, right? And so maybe you don't fit perfectly into the governor's narrative because that's not a priority for, but it may be a big priority for a region of legislators, a delegation, the Buffalo delegation, the Rochester delegation. It may be a priority for the Senate leadership or the Assembly leadership. So as you're crafting your asks, you're listening to the governor's narrative, which is the largest bully pulpit here, but also you're listening to regional narratives that are being created by local legislators, and you're listening to what the houses are hearing from their members on what are going to be priorities for that conference. And you can see on an issue like housing, let's just take, right? Every one of the chambers believes in housing and wants to move housing and affordable housing. How they do that, all of them have a little bit different take in it. So when you're crafting your ask budget wise, you're listening to all those narratives and figuring out how you figure in that to try to get to where you want to get for whoever you're trying to get that money for.
And I'm just gonna piggyback one
Sure.
quick second on water. And for those of you who are watching who don't do or aren't in the government relations world, one of the important reasons to be talking to the legislature, which was our third sort of arrow that I talked about,
Yes.
is that the layering needs to be there when they come to the table to craft the final budget. And if the executive's pushing it, it's great if part of the legislature is too. And the legislative negotiators are going to reach down into the rank and file legislators to say, is this a priority for you or not? So if you haven't done your work in both branches of government, the legislative and the executive, you easily could drop off the table because nobody's boosting or reiterating the priority once it starts being discussed and negotiated. So it's very important that you are working both branches of government when you talk about the budget,
Can't have a one branch strategy.
not a one branch strategy.
Okay, Doug, you said that the personality of the budget director sometimes will influence what's able to be done in the process. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, so it kind of goes back to what Ed said,
Yeah.
knowing the people who've been involved in your issue in the past.
Sure.
And obviously one of the key people involved in drafting and moving the budget through is the budget director. Rob Mohica has been the budget director for a number of years now, and now under multiple players in the budgetary process, from the legislature to governors. And I think that certainly what you can say about Rob is that he's got a depth of knowledge of all of these issues in a way that I don't know that anyone necessarily else has, except for maybe a couple other people in the legislature. But additionally, he has shown, I think, from last year and from his previous jobs that he has the ability to work for the person who is his principal. And so, it's not, going back to Reagan era budget directors, where the budget director was the most important person and it was just under the umbrella of Reaganomics. I don't think there's any economics going on.
Okay.
He is, certainly doing the job that he is asked to do by his principal.
Brilliant. So now we've talked up to this point about defending a budget line that already exists. People are going to want to know, how does it change what you need to do if your budget line is not there already, right? What if you want to add a new one? Tracy, can I ask you to start?
Sure, it's the hardest thing to do. It takes the most amount of work. You need to be extraordinarily organized and strategic. You need to be able to prove up why the spending is in the best interest of the state and within the priorities of the governor and the legislature, because it will take all of that to move a new line forward.
Can I pivot to Ed?
Yeah.
Ed, so new budget line, any tips, any recommendations, given with the very wise things, it's just sort of foregrounded.
Yeah, I think if you're creating a new budget line, you obviously have stakeholders that say there's a hole in financing here.
Yes.
We're able to do this, but we can't do this. Or our organization, we see organizations around the state that are getting government assistance. We're not getting government assistance. Is there a way to do it? So basically, you're starting out with an organization that is performing something in the state or wants to perform something, but is not able to do it. So it's really hard. It's hard to do. But I think when you're building that, I always like to start at the legislative spot, because the organization is in existence. It's got constituents, and they have seen it perform whatever it's doing, and they want it to perform more. So I'm a big believer in that you start working with the legislators in that area, and then work with them to talk to the executive branch about, hey, this is something that we need to do. I think it's really hard to start at the executive on a new line.
And the only place I would nuance that is if you already have an existing line and you're looking to create a new initiative, but you're within the same bureau or agency that you already have strong relationships in. But you would still need the legislative piece to that storytelling and that development.
I'm just gonna be a little tiny ray of sunshine here. No, is that if there is ever an opportunity to do so, it is, it is a moment like this where you've got a new-ish administration coming in. You're going to have some slight changes to the composition of the legislative conferences.
Yes.
So, there is an opportunity to start something that may not have been there before, because there are new or newish people involved.
And on top of it, all the people that are coming back from the legislature are also representing districts that are slightly different than they have represented in the past.
Right.
So now you can also look at that and see if new constituencies, if new members are representing different constituencies that they want to learn more about, and you can bring your story to them and work with them on support.
Yes. To reference back to Doug and to quote the great philosophers, some people wait a lifetime for a moment like this. All right, so I want to sort of pivot now to the economic situation. And we have a question from the audience. Again, if you want to submit a question, there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Hit that, put your question in the chat box and hit submit. So this question just perfectly sums up the next thing I want to ask, which is, what do the early revenue pictures look like for next year? I have heard that $100 million budget gap exists for next year, and with a couple billion after that. Seems like the federal monies are getting tight now. What's your view? What's your view?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think right now it is not, it's certainly not as complete a picture as you're going to have.
All right.
New York's budget process is pretty much a year by year, flying the plane while you're building it strategy, because of the April 1st budget deadline. The state always goes into the drafting of a budget and the passing of a budget with less information than it would have 2 weeks later when tax revenues actually come in.
Right.
You also have, as referenced earlier, the story of inflation. Inflation is driving up prices. People have expectations as to where that's going to end up. We have expectations that the Fed is going to continue to raise interest rates. We had expectations that there would be a much steeper fall in inflation, but the recent CPI report said, no, not so fast. While gas prices went down, food and other energy necessities went up. So you're still at about the same level that you were. These economic conditions are going to, continue to inform the revenue end of the budget. Now, as we've all experienced, certainly back in the days when we had late budgets, the biggest fight was always over how much money is there, and there were radically different ideas as to how much money the state would have. So, are we going into another situation like that? I don't think it'll be as contentious as in the past. They're all Democrats generally. They actually all are, not generally, they are. But while we say we can't necessarily know for certain what the current governor's narrative will be, it'll certainly friendlier than previous governors' narratives. So I don't think it'll be as contentious, but there are, as we've seen, advantages that regardless of party, regardless of friendly relations with the legislature, there are negotiating stances that executives take because of the nature of the creation of the budget. So governors generally tend to be more conservative in terms of how much money is available as opposed to the legislature. The legislature always says, no, there's more, and here it is. So that is something that will continue to go on. I saw a report this morning that sales tax receipts are still higher than expected. So there are unusual numbers out there. I think if you're a betting person, you put your money on that there's certainly going to be less money than there was last year. There still is some federal money out there with the Inflation Reduction Act pumping slightly more money into the economy, but certainly not at the level that it was for last year's budget. So yeah, there's going to be less money most likely to play with this year than certainly than last year.
I also think that one of the wild cards, and it's surprising that we can even have this conversation, is what's going to happen in the federal election cycle. We had a federal election cycle with a Democratic House, Democratic Senate controlled by a New Yorker. And a Democratic president. The odds are starting to favor the Democrats to win the Senate, and that means Chuck Schumer, who's a New Yorker, will still be in charge of that chamber. There's, I think it's wildly optimistic, but still there is a path now, which there wasn't 2 months ago, to the Dems to control the House. And if they do control the House, the odds are that that chamber may also be led by a New Yorker. So that gives you a lot more flexibility on how programs are administered and how monies flow and things like that. So yeah, I think it's a very mixed picture. I think that will definitely have less, but we're always going to have less than last year. But there is some optimistic things out there that say it's not going to be as bad as we think it is.
And some priorities might be looking at one-time bridge funding. So when we talk about new budget lines, when you talk about a budget line, you're hoping that you're going to get a line that you can keep continuity of funding. But even as a start, if you're somebody who hasn't been contemplated in the budget before, or you have a project that is a capital project or one-time seed money or bridge money to help a program or to help a community move to the next level, the money that's coming in from the feds and all in a few different ways or leftover from last year is one-time funding. So that's also a way to view and think about what you're bringing forward to be part of New York State's budget on whether it's continuity in programming, is it seed funding or bridge funding, is it one shot, is it capital?
And the only other thing I would, so we're talking about how much actual money is available and, the actual data. The other end of this is the political story. What are people actually feeling about how much money there is?
Okay.
Under Clinton, there was the recession or the expansion that wasn't an expansion that, people didn't feel like things were getting better when all the numbers said things were getting better for everybody. We might be heading into a similar type situation where the economic numbers are saying one thing, what was called the misery index by Ronald Reagan, or the economic discomfort index by Arthur Okun, that is going down. Yet, you see articles in the paper talking to, regular people, say, how is inflation affecting you? It's killing you. It's really bad. It's this, it's that. And so, it's not lining up with what economic numbers are telling people necessarily. And then, of course, you have the reaction of Wall Street.
Right.
Really bad day. So, there's the actual hard data versus people's perception of the data, and both things are very real, and both things have a very real impact on the creation of a budget.
I mean, so much of this is politicized now. I wonder after November if we're just going to trade which 50% of the population thinks the economy is bad now.
Yeah.
So actually on that point, people do want to ask about politics. Someone wants to know if Hochul wins with a huge mandate, how may that affect things? And then the sort of follow-on question is, do we think that she will put a lot of policy in the budget this year? And so a further question than that would be, which policy, depending on how big that mandate is? Tracy, it looks like you want to start.
I mean, I think if Governor Hochul wins in this election cycle and becomes the governor for a full term, that I actually think regardless of what her whether or not it was heartily, handedly, or by a margin, she's shown herself to be a fearless leader who steps forward with what she believes is the direction the state should be in, and she set forth a vision that way. I think we're going to see that vision even more strikingly and strongly, because this will be her administration as opposed to sort of the tail end and closing up somebody else's. So I would tell you, I think whether or not it's a mandate, I think her spending sense is going, it's just a gut feeling, but I think the priorities she's going to set and how she's going to spend the money and how she's going to work with the state's budget, we certainly got a glimpse of that last year when she put forward her budget. I also do think that there were some lessons learned by her administration. And how they were working with the legislature, and how they will work with the legislature this time around. So, no, I don't think it matters if it's a mandate.
Lessons learned. Can you say more about that? That was very interesting.
So, one of the things that we saw in the budget, the former governor had a tactic where he defunded everything that the legislature wanted and forced them to buy back all of their priorities. Monies that had been spent in the budget for decades required the legislature to buy back, as opposed to saying, guess what, I believe in these policies too, and so I'm going to fund them. And I think this administration came to the budget process and said, look, we are collaborative government. The legislature has believed in these initiatives. We're going to build those initiatives into the funding of the budget to show the olive branch and to say, yes, I agree with you. The state should continue this funding. And that's not how the legislature was used to seeing the budget or receiving the budget, but also claiming success in the budget. They like to be part of the budget negotiation. If you hand everything over to them, then all they have left to do is to ask for all new. And if there's no money to ask for all new, then you're in a very different situation. And I think that there were just some lessons learned on communication and cooperation and the need for all folks to believe that they are part of the process and they are going to help New Yorkers steer the ship here. And so the legislature, although because of Silver Reed Pataki doesn't really have a role, we have given sort of this showmanship game that there is a role there. So, but what I mostly want to say to you is I do believe that Governor Hochul's spending and budget will not change based on the outcome of how substantial she wins or doesn't.
Sure. Doug, I think the ball was being passed to you.
Well, yeah, no, and I think, this is the eternal question left over from Silver Reed Pataki, which is, how much policy can I put into a budget? And, governors have used this tool in a number of different ways. Some of them have used it to put forward actual policies that they wanted to see enacted and fought for, and this was their vehicle to do so. It's the best vehicle to do it. It's the only real way that the governor gets to introduce directly into the legislature, pieces of legislation. So, there is always going to be a component of the budget that is policy oriented that may or may not have a tangential link to the spending plan that is also put forward. That being said, I don't know that we can say exactly how the next governor is going to use it. I don't think we can say with any certainty how Governor Hochul is going to use it. We know how the last governor used it. We know how the last governor made statements like, well, once the budget's done, I'm done, and walks away from the business of lawmaking until he has to deal with all the laws that the legislature or the bills the legislature passed. I think we have seen a greater collaboration. I mean, I know we have between the legislature and the governor. But I don't know that necessarily inhibits Governor Hochul from putting forward her top policies, whether they're necessarily budget or not. It remains to be seen, but it will always be a part, and governors will always use it for their top line priorities.
And it starts conversations. It allows conversations to start within our communities and within the legislature, that she can get it out there and have the conversation and start looking at policy and start shaping policy, because legislating and policy making is slow and complicated.
That's a good point.
and
They can always sort of get rid of a part and then come back to it later as a bill. Ed, did you?
I was just gonna, on the mandate question, so voters now tend to not decouple as much. People tend to vote much more like, so let's use the premise that Hochul has a large mandate. If you assume that she does have a large mandate, people don't decouple as they go down the ballot. That means that the Senate Democrats are going to have a good night. It means the Assembly Democrats are going to have a good night. Most importantly, you have 6 races in New York at the congressional level, that could go, that are within the margins. If all 6 of those were to go to the Democrats, that would be significant. And, if you look at the first round of, the ads that she's been running, they very much nationalize the race. They talk about abortion, they talk about extremism. So that's very, very interesting. So I think the premise, if she has a big night, you would assume that the rest of the party has a big night. And if that bleeds into a big night for the national party picking up some seats in New York, that I just think I agree totally with Tracy that her priorities are not going to change. Her ability to make those priorities happen, though, increase exponentially with the size of the margin.
Well, you bring up a good point, that if it's a good night down the line, what does everybody take away from that? So,
Right.
Governor Hochul has a mandate to do what? Because her mandate might not be the same as if the Senate Dems have a strong night, that might be a different kind of mandate.
Fascinating.
So, the lessons that people will take away from it may, not necessarily be compatible. So it'll be interesting to see what the narrative that comes out of this is. A mandate is, only as good as what you do with it.
So I like following up that, I think you watched Long Island, right? So at the beginning of this, people thought that the Senate Dems were in trouble on Long Island. So it'd be interesting to see in the suburbs, where do independents go? Does the Dobbs decision impact down ballot races? So those are the kind of things that what I'll be watching for is those kind of races, and seeing, like Doug said, it is when people come and vote out, are they nationalizing the race? Are they localizing the race? But one thing you can always say is that no matter what happens, if it's a big night for Democrats in New York, the national press will focus on her, and she will have as all New York governors have, the ability to really, really be involved in a big way on a national stage. And I know, Tracy, that she's in charge of, for the Democratic Governors Association, all the reproductive issues moving forward and how those play out. So she's going to have a really bully pulpit nationally. And if she has a mandate in the state, it makes it easier for her to do a lot of things.
All right, so we have a comment from someone that says the initial PowerPoint screen was great and very helpful. And to that I say, thank you, Mom, for attending. But the next question is, would we be able to share it? Yes, we will share it to you all when we send the link to the video of this. So if you registered for the webinar, you'll receive that at the end. The next question we have here is, what do we think will be the focus of the state of the state? So we're probably talking about, what is that overall narrative? Can we project any of the contents of it, especially if Hochul is, first of all, not having to run for election anymore?
Well, I think we can also, the state of the state is generally, viewed as the precursor to the budget. So the things that are mentioned in the state of the state generally will appear in the budget. Although I think we all have seen big announcements at state of the states that then disappear into the ether.
Okay,
But they may have been policy.
right.
But that being said, I think that goes back to what is the governor coming out of this election with?
Sure.
Is it a mandate? I think to Tracy's point, obviously there are things that are going to be part of that reproductive right. I mean, those core issues of hers will be a part of her state of the state. Environmental issues, housing issues, education issues. These are things that are always part of governors taking control and putting their stamp on the state. So there will be things, and then of course there's criminal justice, something that some, the Long Island races in particular are the ones that people are watching to see how those are impacted. Does that alter necessarily what is proposed? Remains to be seen. But do we know right now, are there any
Well, I mean,
other things that we should expect to see in a state of the state?
I think one of the things that we've seen her talk a lot about, that has really become an issue since she's been governor is the lack of workforce. And the fact that the economy is shifting also and how people are working, where they're working, and what kind of jobs we have the ability to be projecting, in 10 years, 20 years out, and how we're going to hold on to our brain drain, how we're going to keep our college kids here. So where is New York on the cutting edge? I mean, we saw in her last budget a lot of money focused at creating the healthcare workforce of the future. Healthcare is no longer the only workforce that is, really stretched so very thin, and industries that are faltering because there's nobody to work in them. There are a number of places, there've been a couple of conferences lately that are talking about, we have some really great resources here in forestry and what that could mean moving forward based on the skill sets. We need to hold on to those skill sets because there may be an energy piece there. And if we start losing workforce in certain areas and we're not retraining for what the future is going to look like with those technical skills, New York won't have the trained workforce that we've always been able to pose on. And we've heard her talk about that. And it's something she's actually talked about a lot in her career. And that's making sure that working families have the ability to find jobs, that they are jobs of the future as well. So I think we saw a wink at that being one of the issues she cares really deeply about as she built out in her last budget. And I think that we'll be looking at how are they looking at how the environment is going to affect what kind of workforce we have here in the state of New York, and how do we grow that workforce, because we have more jobs than we have workers right now.
Ed, can I ask about what's her grip on local issues, local projects that might end up in the budget?
Yeah, well, I think, just following up on what Tracy said, first of all, there's nobody that's traveled the state of New York more than this governor. And so she's met with town officials, village officials. She's been all over the state and heard, because she went to places that most places people don't go to, and has done that for a long time. And so
In particular.
yeah. So she, I think, has an intuitive sense of what these smaller parts of the state are looking for, plus the big issues. I think this follows up on what Tracy said. I think she has an opportunity. She's given up her emergency powers. We're not sure where COVID is, but most of the experts say we can now see the end, light at the end of the tunnel. Things have fundamentally changed in this state, the nature of work, all of those things. So I think she has an opportunity to say, this is where New York's future looks. This is, as Tracy was talking about, the environment. We have the CLCPA. How do we comply with that, create jobs, stay on the cutting edge of that? We have to reconfigure and rethink our central cities if 1/3 of office space is not going to be filled on a given day. We were a tourist mecca. How do we get that to come back, and all those things? So I think the real thing for her and all these issues tie in, but what does New York, she has the ability to set the agenda for what New York looks like post-pandemic. And we all know that pre-pandemic New York is not where post-pandemic New York is going to be, can't be, and be sustainable. So I think that to me is the opportunity that she has. And there's probably nobody better to do that than her, because she literally has been every place. Doug said the other day that she's like the Johnny Cash commercial. Like she's been everywhere. You just put small town in New York as the names that she's in. So that's a really, right person at the right place. So I think that's what I think her opportunity is.
All right, so we've got some really brilliant questions that have come in. If you have any at the last minute, there's that chat box at the bottom of your screen when you push the button that says Q&A. This one is, do we think Governor Hochul, if it's Governor Hochul, will push for an on-time budget? And what are the biggest obstacles to achieving that?
I think so. I mean,
Yeah.
I think we're in the time of an on-time, or a pretty on-time budget by virtue of the fact that under David Patterson, if there isn't an on-time budget, the legislature loses a lot of their negotiating powers. So
Okay.
even if it weren't on time, it's not going to August like we've seen in the past. I mean, it's just not gonna happen.
Famous last word.
We also, I'm gonna knock on wood because I don't wanna work till August on the budget, but what I mean, we also have a legislature that has never lived without a paycheck.
Mm.
The way those legislatures used to. I mean, I think there's less than 30 members who ever were part of late budget cycles. I mean, that's really incredible in both houses and both sides of the aisle. It never is that small. So when you start looking at what it means to not get a paycheck, and then what it means to have to adopt a budget that you had no input on,
Yes.
it does change it. So I think that we will have a pretty on-time budget, if not exactly on time. What was the second part?
So actually, can I pivot here a little bit? Because you've given us all the push factors towards an on-time budget. Doug, the other part of the question is, what are the obstacles to an on-time budget?
Well, so the obstacles are, as I mentioned earlier, knowledge of what actual money is out there.
Okay,
It's an uncertain economic environment. One of the big drivers of the New York budget, is Wall Street. The bonuses paid to Wall Street executives, as much as we'd like to not think that it is, a very large component, and it's something that is very concerning. Every year they try to get a handle on what it is. Some of the other obstacles to that, where
How much do they want to spend?
well, yeah, I mean, so, what stance is the legislature going to take?
sure.
Is the legislature going to take an aggressive stance that's, that really puts forth proposals that go far beyond what the governor is proposing? Do we create this dynamic of upstate versus downstate?
Yes.
We can all sort of envision apocalyptic scenarios where everything sort of falls apart and you've got factions fighting all over. I think that's highly unlikely. The personalities of the leaders don't really lead you to think that relations are going to break down in such a way that a late budget will be a thing. I think also the expectations are such now that nobody. It used to be April 1st. Yeah, good luck. There's no budget by April 1st. But it's been, now the standard is an on-time budget, and I think people want to stick to that, because you certainly, even whoever with Governor Hochul starting a 4-year term, you don't want to start out with the first thing is a late budget. So now does the narrative then become she can't govern? So I think all told, it's highly unlikely that there'll be a late
I'm
budget.
just gonna jump, and I'm sorry, can I go one quick second based on him? I'm sorry to do this
That's
to you,
fair.
but I think that the other piece is. This is the beginning of a new administration, not the extension of the past administration. And the way the relationships were between leaders and the governor were set up to be purposefully contentious. And, they have the ability to change what the budget negotiation is like anyway. I mean, look, this is the Pollyanna part of me, and the world that they all want to live in, because I live in it in my head. But we have really a great opportunity right now to say, we're working with strong leaders who agree philosophically on the direction they want to see the state go,
Yes.
and where the differences are incremental as opposed to philosophical.
Mhm.
And so, can we come to a budget where we're not insulting each other and undercutting, and actually can New York benefit in this really tumultuous time? with a government that can come together and work on in our best interest instead of showmanship for Twitter's sake. And I think that we've seen some changes in the election cycle that could potentially lead us there if people are willing to work for the people. Sorry, Ed.
Okay, and that's very nice. And, I'm gonna tell you what I think the biggest impediment is gonna be, which is you have programs that continually grow. And so that program, they think, okay, I'm automatically gonna get a 5% increase. So the governor's office says, it's a tough year, we're gonna come in with a 2% increase. So they expect 5%, and then they're gonna say, well, I lost 6% of my programming last year, and I think inflation is gonna be 6% this year. So I needed for real growth, I need 11%. You're giving me 2%. And I'm that, so then you're suddenly taking, and then I need an extra 6% for this year. So you're going from I need 15%, you're giving me 2, I'm taking a 13% hit. And that's the way people are gonna portray, even if they get a $1 increase in what the governor puts in, they're gonna say, well, this is in real world, this is a 13% cut for me. And that, I think, is potentially the largest impediment that we're looking at.
And I completely agree.
All right, so this question I find to be absolutely fascinating, but I think it's pitched towards Tracy. What will be the impact on the health budget table, the health budget table, due to the retirement of Assemblyman Godfrey and key staff changes in that area?
Yeah.
That's a good-
And what advocacy steps can you take now before we get a new health chair appointed? And I think we all know that's going to have a cascading effect on
Right.
chairs. So this is where everyone can chime in.
Right, so, health is still, it's still health and education. That are the two biggest spend sites in our budget, and that doesn't change based on who's running those committees. So the spending is still going to be significant there. Staff has turned over in both houses a lot, so there really isn't deep institutional knowledge of somebody in the health committee or in Ways and Means has had a little bit more stability. That, that comes to this with decades of experience of what's been going on. We have a change in the Medicaid director. We only have an acting Medicaid director right now. And folks on the second floor have shifted around, and DOB has the health team that they've had for a bit here. And they've been rising up through the ranks. So when you sit and look at what's going to happen at health, what can you do now? You can be talking to Department of Health, even though they have changed a lot, they're still changing and they haven't sort of settled in. If you know the bureau in which the spending is that you're going to be part of, talking to that bureau and being part of the conversation is very important. Speaking to central staff and speaking to Ways and Means and finance staff in the health committees are very important, and speaking with the Division of Budget. I would dare say, but I didn't say it out loud, I would talk to the chamber too. So the people that we know are going to be there, we hope, as great public servants, we thank them for their service and hope they'll be there to work with us next year. I would talk to those folks while we wait and see who the electeds will be. The moving in an election year is always difficult. Moving in the budget, there's always some time for people to get their feet on the ground. But even with the new staff, there is, a level of the budget that people do understand it and will move forward. The folks in Ways and Means are really, really great. The folks in Finance Committee are doing a really great job. So I'd be working there, the agency.
I would not want to be the scheduler for the person who gets that job.
Right. Yeah, I mean, we've had 2 health chairs in the assembly and
50 years.
Yes.
yeah,
50 years.
so Jim Talon and Dick Godfrey. I mean, and it has to have an impact. I mean,
Right.
you lose that much institutional knowledge, it will definitely have an impact. But that's also, a place of opportunity for, people like us who have been around, who know some of the history. I mean, I'm not going to say any of us are on a par with somebody who's done it for, 30, 40 years,
Yes.
but they're with.
On Ed, right?
They're all a little bit.
Wait, did you know 3 health chairs?
I knew Talon,
And gun.
So too.
Okay.
But this is where, you can bring your own
Mhm.
knowledge of the process and not in, this is, one of the aspects of lobbying that is somewhat overlooked. It is, the institutional knowledge that you can bring to help people settle into new positions and bring them up to speed with, certain stories or aspects or laws or whatever that they may not be aware of, that they've had no reason to be aware of because they weren't in the position they were in.
Fascinating. So first we lost the Queen, then Dick Godfrey. It really is the end of an era, guys.
Yeah.
So the last question we have time for, it's based on the, what's that?
Is there a connection?
It's in your mind. So last question is, now that we have given the Bills $600 million for a new stadium, will they win the Super Bowl this year?
That's Doug.
So when I was a kid, in 1980, the Bills had a linebacker, Isaiah Robertson, who started a song that goes a little bit like this. I got a feeling Buffalo is going to the Super Bowl. It's not the last time, but Buffalo is going to the Super Bowl. So I think they've got as good a shot as they've ever had.
Thank you. for
That was very
That was
impressive, I
very
have to
good.
tell you, I would not have given you that. What do you think, Ed?
I'm gonna say this, Josh Allen, my fantasy quarterback, I'm all in on the Bills.
All right. Well, thank you all at home for joining us for our webinar preparing for the next budget and legislative session. Have a great afternoon, and just remember that chart will be mailed to you. So thank you for attending. Bye.